you're a separatist. This is the now or never. Like, if people vote no to a referendum, there may never be another one, right? Like, the stakes are much higher. I think there's a lot of people, especially that are watching a lot of CBC News and CTV News, and that aren't going outside a lot. Maybe they live in the suburbs where you don't have these problems. Maybe they live in a retirement home, in the case of some of the boomers. Or maybe they're just not as conscious when they're walking around. A lot of us nowadays have earphones in our ears when we walk around our phones. But if you get on a plane, you go to any city center in Canada, you turn off your phone, you look around, it's not going well. And the statistics show it's also not going well. Inflation, the price of housing, the salaries that young people are making, the statistics about optimism. There's a lot of very deep problems in Canada, and Donald Trump's not the cause of those problems. A misconception of the election of Mark Carney has been that all the problems caused by Justin Trudeau, whether it's inflation, whether it's crime, whether it's homelessness, whether it's immigration, that they've suddenly all been fixed. That's what the media is telling us, because they're not covering these stories anymore. And I've heard this from some young people who choose not to vote. What's the point? They will all do the same thing. I mean, in my case in Ontario, Doug Ford is as liberal as Mark Carney. It's like, if you're a young person and that's the liberal, the conservative, they govern in arguably the same way, what's the point? I don't think it's too late to fix Canada, but, and this is the big caveat, the changes have to be big.
Thank you so much, Élie Cantin-Nantel, for joining us today. We're very glad to have you. We're very impressed with all your journalistic work, the journalistic integrity you display, and also your ability to be an independent journalist as well, and starting your whole media company all by yourself. So if anybody doesn't know much about you, just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yes, absolutely. My name is Élie Cantin-Nantel. I'm a journalist, commentator, YouTuber based in Ottawa, our nation's capital, and I'm a conservative. And I began this journey 6 years ago. And the reason why I did is because I was looking at CTV and CBC, and those were kind of the two big media at the time. And I was seeing that conservatives were not represented. So what would happen is they would do these panels, and they would have a hardcore liberal, a hardcore NDP, and then they would find some lobbyist who maybe worked for like a year in Stephen Harper's government. And that would be the so-called conservative voice. And this person would just repeat liberal talking points. And so I became increasingly frustrated. And I said, well, if they're not going to give conservatives a voice, then I will. So during COVID, I started a little podcast in my living room, and I interviewed some members of parliament, some columnists. That ended up getting me a job on Parliament Hill. I did that for a little bit. I worked for the Post Millennial during COVID as well, and I gave a voice to people who were being impacted by lockdowns, like business owners, gym owners, churches, restaurants, while the media was demonizing them as selfish grandma killers. And then really the start of my journalism career, at least when I really started taking it seriously, was in 2022 when I started working for True North as their Ottawa-based journalist. And 2 weeks after I signed my contract, the Freedom Convoy rolled into town. So that was my first big assignment. And since then, I kind of discovered a love for talking to people, for covering news. I did this at True North for 2 years. I went and did a small stint at the Hub for a year. And last summer, I decided to start my own independent media venture. Again, a bit frustrated. Like we were starting finally to see some conservative content, but I thought we lacked some, more deep, a bit better quality type content. Like we didn't have a Daily Wire, we didn't have a Daily Caller, we didn't have a National Review like they do in the US. We didn't have PragerU. We didn't have people like Megyn Kelly or Ben Shapiro. So I thought, I'm not consuming any basically Canadian content because there's nothing that I really like. I'm only consuming American content. I'm going to try to create the show that I would watch and the content that I would watch as a consumer. So it's basically explainer journalism, it's underground investigations, it's interviews, and it's monologue style podcasts. And it's been quite successful so far. We've grown 3,000% since launching. The videos are now getting more views than some channels with 200,000 subscribers. We get more views than the legacy medias that is funded by the government. So far, so good. I mean, we're still very early on in the startup phase. But I'm very satisfied with how things have gone so far.
And if people want to be able to find all that, where can people find you and find your media venture as well?
Yes, that's a good question. You just type my name, Élie Cantin-Nantel. That's Eliecantinnantel up on YouTube. You also find me on X, Ellie_MCN.
And all of that will be linked down below. So please do go follow and check Ellie out.
Yeah, and I'll kind of say another thing. I really started following you when you started talking about Alberta independence. I had seen you peripherally before that, but a lot of national conservative content creators would not touch the issue. I don't know if they didn't want to split their audience or they just didn't want to report on the subjects. You, on the other hand, dived headfirst kind of into that subject matter. And it was very impressive considering other national conservative content creators wouldn't touch the subject.
Well, yeah. So the reason why I'm interested in this is, look, I'm not a separatist personally. I'm a journalist who covers news, and I am from Quebec. Is if you can maybe tell with my accent, although people say my accent's gotten better over the years. So we have a. I know all about separatism because everyone in my family voted yes 2 times in 1980 and 1995 to leave Canada. So I've had extensive conversations with separatists in Quebec and their frustrations with Ottawa. When I was working on Parliament Hill, I worked for an Alberta MP and I got to go work in Alberta for a little bit. I was a campaign manager for a nomination campaign and then I worked in the 2021 election. And the stuff I was hearing at the doors in Alberta resembled word for word what I was hearing from my separatist family members in Quebec about Ottawa not treating us right, about how we're overtaxed, et cetera, et cetera. So I began then, and this was now 5 years ago, to be like, oh, there's something happening here. And when I saw the big switcheroo last year with Mark Carney coming along and the polls suddenly showing he could win, right away I was onto the story before anyone else. I did a deep dive in the hub, being like, this is a real possibility. I predicted this would happen. And now that it's happening, like I actually think this is the biggest story in Canada. And it's something that's not being talked about enough. There was a poll that showed that support for separatism could be as high as 41%. On top of that, I know many people, including very fancy people, people who even worked for in the Alberta government prior, who are not separatist, but that will vote yes to send Ottawa a message. So if you have 41% who vote yes and 10% who just want to send Ottawa a message, it's 51%. This is Brexit, Trump 2016 all over again. So it's a big story. And I got into it because as a journalist, I've always covered the stories that are undercovered by legacy media. And I've always given a voice to those who aren't given a voice by legacy media. And in the case of separatism, it's a story that's not being covered enough. The separatists aren't being covered fairly. So I gave him a voice, but I also wanted to do it fair and balanced. So while I did my documentary, we interviewed Jeff Rath. We also interviewed Thomas Lukasik, and we gave both of them a very fair interview and an opportunity to express themselves.
And I think and I wanted to get into your documentary. I think that was is one of the most important things to do is to be able to have those two contrasting voices, which we get very siloed within our bubble, our opinion, and what we want to see or what people that follow us want to see, but not giving the other side kind of a fair time of day and having that important debate. But you also mentioned there Quebec and you knowing about that independence movement on itself. So how do you see both of them right now on the either on the ground or when you talk to people?
That's a good question. So there is also a resurgence of separatism in Quebec a little bit, as in the Parti québécois, which was the separatist party that maybe a lot of people thought was completely dead after the last election. This party, which used to win majority governments, was reduced to 3 seats, uh, began to be projected to re-win a majority government. So basically, you would have a party go from 3 seats to 63 seats. But what's interesting in Quebec was this was more tied to frustrations with the current government, the Francois Legault government, the government that famously imposed curfews, a government that famously banned the unvaccinated from grocery store, a government that made many provinces that they've broken, that's been engaged in many spending scandals. So in the Quebec Liberal Party, so something interesting about Quebec politics is French Quebecers and Anglophone Quebecers have very, very different values. They're just very, very different. And Quebec Liberals, which is usually the alternative party, began to be seen as the Anglophone party because they have a higher percentage of voting the Anglophone. So a lot of French Canadians decided, well, we don't like Francois Legault, but we also don't want the party of Anglophones. So they started to go back to the PQ. But what's interesting in Quebec is even though the PQ now has risen a bit, although their poll numbers have dipped recently, separatism itself isn't really on the rise the way it is in Alberta. There was a poll not long ago that showed that it's actually quite low now. And I spoke to a relative recently who was hardcore separatist, and this person told me, and I will add that this person is hovering close to the boomer age. They told me, yes, I like the idea of Quebec independence, but right now with Donald Trump, it's just not the time. Whereas I don't hear that in Alberta. People aren't saying in Alberta, let's wait until Trump is gone. They're saying, let's do this now. And so that I would say that's kind of my analysis there.
And even saying, well, let's use Trump, like would recognize an independent Alberta. But recently we just heard Premier Daniel Smith's announcement on what the actual question on the referendum on October 19th will be. And we were talking a little bit about it backstage, but what was your reaction to the referendum on a referendum now?
So I will say that's not what I expected. So obviously Daniel Smith was put in a tough position. I before the even we had the federal election last year, I was thinking to myself, how is she going to handle this? Because Alberta politics differs from our conservative politics in Ontario because it's very grassroots. In Ontario, the elites run the Ontario PC party. In Alberta, the grassroots are in charge of the UCP. So when a premier does something the base doesn't like, they're usually gone. So how is she going to navigate that? Now, she had made a promise after the Recall Gondek campaign to recall the horrible mayor that Calgary was subjected to for 4 years. And there was a recall petition, and people were like, this threshold is too high. So she had announced that she would look at the citizen initiative. So because she had already made that commitment after the election, she decided to announce she would lower the threshold. And I thought this was brilliant because then she can say, it's not me. They want a referendum, power to the people. Now, there was a second petition, the Thomas Lukasik petition, which was, do you want Alberta to remain in Canada? The issue with that one is it's a policy referendum, not a constitutional referendum. There's two types of referendums that people can trigger. And I just thought that she would say, well, I'm the premier. We're going to put this question anyways. In fact, I'd heard from journalists in Alberta, people that I know that are journalists, they're legacy media journalists. They thought that's what she was going to do, and they thought it would make sense for her to do that. Instead, she announced that she would do the referendum on a referendum. Um, I can understand some of the rationale behind that. Number one, she wasn't elected on a promise to do a separatist referendum. Number two, there is some legal issues. Again, the judge struck it down. If she were to do her own, the First Nations may sue again and struck it down that way. But there's also a big risk here because what this comes across as is it comes across as trying to appease everybody. And politicians in the past have gotten in a lot of trouble when they've tried and failed to do something like that. So we're seeing that the anti-separatists are already upset. They're like, why would you even entertain these people in the first place? And I've spoken to some separatists, very prominent separatist leaders, who say this is the end of her political career. Now, I think this is a little bit premature. I think she's very smart. She's very tactical. Let's see where this goes. But this, having made that particular decision, is a bit risky, and I think it may end up being the biggest gamble of her political career.
Well, I also think it's very interesting because now I see a clear path for independence, meaning there has to be two referendums in order to get separation. The first one, you're obviously not going to campaign on independence. You'll campaign on we want a better deal. And the polling shows up to 60% of people want a better deal. So if you can get them to vote, yes, we want a better deal, we want through independence, and then it goes to this waiting period to see what Mark Carney is going to throw at it. And if he doesn't throw enough, then they go into the next referendum, which then that would be the actual independence referendum. But you've already broken down the barrier of entry for a lot of people to vote yes on independence. So maybe it provides a little bit easier of a path by convincing some people to go over.
Well, that's an interesting observation. I didn't actually know in a monologue I'm doing for my podcast and I'm releasing today, which is on Friday, that this question actually does have more benefit to separatists. First of all, I think if you're a federalist, you're less motivated to go out and vote no to referendum than you would be to go out and vote to stop separation. Like they're two very different things. Whereas if you're a separatist, this is the now or never. Like if people vote no to a referendum, there may never be another one, right? Like the stakes are much higher. Secondly, as I was saying earlier, those people, the closet separatists and the people who just want to send Ottawa a message, if you want to send Ottawa a message and you're taking a risk if it's a binding constitutional referendum that could lead to separation. You're still taking a risk. If it's just to have a referendum, you're not taking as big of a risk. So there's a lot more incentives now to vote yes. And this is why I think Danielle Smith actually sent a very strong warning to Mark Carney here in being like, we're not being taken for granted anymore. We're giving people this option. And I think there's a greater chance that this passes than people think there is because the yes side, if you vote yes, if you're just a conservative who's frustrated but doesn't want independence, but you would like to see this stuff play out because you think longer term you'll get a better deal, which is what Quebec got, by the way. You have a lot more incentive to vote yes on this one than you would have had on a real referendum.
And with your time doing the on the ground in Alberta, doing the documentary, but also talking to leaders, but also regular people, what did you see as the core drivers for and against independence, economically, politically, culturally, and what surprised you of the answers when you were talking to people?
And that's a very good question. So, what differs Alberta separatism from Quebec separatism is Quebec separatism is very cultural. It's linguistic. We want our own country where we can speak French, where we can have our own culture. The main arguments I heard from people in Alberta, they're economic mostly. They're about cost of living. They're about resources. So there were people that are like they're screwing us over. They're taking our money and they're killing our industry. That tends to be the main thing, and also frustration with the political process. So you look at, I talked about this in my documentary. Alberta and Quebec have a lot more seats in Parliament than Alberta and Saskatchewan. Now, you people will say, yeah, but they have more people. Fair. You look at the Senate. Atlantic Canada, which has around half the population of Alberta and Saskatchewan, have double the number of senators. So Alberta is like basically systematically underrepresented in both chambers of parliament. So that was another frustration. For the people that are voting no, I will say that, I'll just add it. Having said that, Mark Carney, of course, was the final straw for a lot of people. That's always what I saw. For the people voting no, so I spoke to students, and a lot of students just told me like basically that's not a priority for them. I mean, they're just focused on getting their degree and trying to get by in Trudeau or Carney's Canada, and they haven't really bought into the idea of separatism as much. And for other people that maybe are much more hardened anti-separatists, like Thomas Lukasik, he's just fundamentally opposed to this idea. He came to Canada with his family when they were younger, looking to move to Canada. He's worried about the implications maybe of losing a Canadian passport. And he also made some economic arguments that were repeated by Trevor Toomb, who's a professor at the University of Calgary, that, well, there could actually be economic damages. Alberta's a landlocked province. There could be some non-tariff trade barriers. So basically, even if you're not going to have tariffs with Canada, you're going to have different regulations. You have to hire people to deal with these regulations, et cetera. So there could be some costs there as well. And also, there's some worry that the whole thing is going to be very messy. I mean, you look at Brexit; it took years to figure out, and that was just leaving the EU. Imagine leaving Canada, and imagine dealing with a hostile Ottawa and judges and lawsuits and all of that stuff.
And in your opinion, because you've been to in multiple parts of the country and of Canada, both Alberta, but also time in Quebec and then Ottawa, do you think people are living in the Canada that they think they're living in?
I think Canada has a lot of problems. A misconception of the election of Mark Carney has been that all the problems caused by Justin Trudeau, whether it's inflation, whether it's crime, whether it's homelessness, whether it's immigration, that they've suddenly all been fixed. That's what the media is telling us because they're not covering these stories anymore. I recently went to Winnipeg, to Edmonton, to Vancouver. I was in Calgary. I've been to Toronto. Of course, I live in Ottawa. I've been to Montreal. There's homelessness everywhere. In Edmonton, it looks like a literal war zone. There are drug addicts walking around like zombies, and not just one or two, but hundreds. It was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen in my life. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. So I think there's a lot of people, especially that are watching a lot of CBC News and CTV News, and that aren't going outside a lot. Maybe they live in the suburbs where you don't have these problems. Maybe they live in a retirement home in case of some of the boomers. or maybe they're just not as conscious when they're walking around. A lot of us nowadays have earphones in our ears when we walk around or on our phones. But if you get on a plane, you go to any city center in Canada, you turn off your phone, you look around, it's not going well. And the statistics show it's also not going well. Inflation, the price of housing, the salaries that young people are making, young people's, the statistics about optimism. Um, there's a lot of very deep problems in Canada, and Donald Trump's not the cause of those problems.
Well, maybe we'll have a little bit difference of opinion, but I'd like to get your opinion on this one. We've already fled Canada. We now do our work from Mexico City and things like that. But the only way I don't see Canada as fixable at this point, Pierre Poilievre has lost, and it's 3 years to another election. By the time I see a conservative even potentially getting power, Canada will be in absolute rubble. My way of fixing Canada is maybe to save Alberta through independence. You can, if they get independence, they can effect change in a timely manner at a degree conservatives can't really even dream of in national Canada at this point.
That's so. I've heard that argument before. My opinion is that it's not too late, and the reason is if you look, you guys are near South America. And Mexico is in North America, but it's a Latin country. You look at El Salvador. El Salvador was just rippled with crime. I have a friend who's from El Salvador, and it was 6 years ago. He was telling me literally, this is his country. He was calling his country an S-hole country. You looked at Argentina. Argentina had some of the worst economic conditions, not only in the Americas, but in the world. In Argentina, they elected Javier Milei, and they're doing much better now economically. And in the case of El Salvador, they elected Mr. Bukele, and El Salvador is now safer than Canada. And they're seeing a tourism boom and an economic boom. So I don't think it's too late to fix Canada, but, and this is a big caveat, the changes have to be big. You cannot just go and govern like the UK conservatives did for like 10 to 15 years and a lot of problems to continue. If that's the case, then I would agree with you that Canada will continue going down a dark path, and many people, including myself, will probably leave. But if you're able to get someone in there that puts in pretty strong changes, and Pierre Poilievre had promised one of the big interviews he did before the election with Jordan Peterson, he said, right away, you'll notice a crackdown on crime. If he was able to go and do that, a big policy that I'm advocating for almost on every show is reopening mental health institutions. That was one of the biggest mistakes we did, was the institutionalization. We basically decided it was humane to put people who are sick and suffering onto the streets rather than taking care of them as a society. Like, I don't know who the heck thought that was a good idea. If we do stuff like that, we reduce immigration, we start enforcing the laws, I think we could start to see some positive changes. Of course, we also have to double our oil and gas production, in my opinion, to make Canada rich again. So I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's ever too late to solve a country. But I do think that you need some big changes. Little like 2% tax cuts, hiring a couple extra peace officers, sort of thing won't be enough. You need pretty structural changes to make things better.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying there. And I think everybody all conservatives in Canada can see that's the path. Poilievre laid out that path as well. I guess my real question is, do we, as national conservatives or as conservatives in Canada, are we being told we have to wait 3 years for those changes for another election? Or do you see a faster way to enact change?
And that's a good question. I think there is a faster way to enact change, and it would be, social and political pressure. You look at the convoy. None of the convoy people were elected, and they managed to get all the provinces to drop their restrictions. It took a bit longer with Trudeau, but that's because Trudeau was full of ego and pride, and he couldn't make it seem that he had given in. So he waited a couple of months, but eventually he did too. And there were some other countries that had reimposed restrictions in the fall of 2022. Some countries reimposed the mask mandates for airplanes. Canada never did. They had basically put a precedent that, like, this is done. We actually had a stronger precedent than, I would argue, even the U.S. on that issue. The Liberals have reduced immigration. There was Mark Miller at one point even said he thought there was too many Indian students in Canada. Mark Miller of the Liberal Party. So, Mark Carney has shown that he's willing to flip a little bit here and there. I still don't think he's a good prime minister. I still think he's a liberal ideologue at the core, and that he's just governing like this because he knows the Trudeau policies are very unpopular. But it has been shown that you can enact some of these policies through political pressure, social pressure, through media. I mean, this is why I think you guys having a podcast, me having a podcast is so important, so we can expose people to these things, do petitions, etc. So, I don't think we should wait for 3 years and do nothing and allow them to continue to destroy the country. I think we need to be more activated, more motivated, and find new ways to motivate people. And in my opinion, transform that motivation on whatever issue it is into a vote for the Conservative Party.
And on that, I wanted to ask you, what do you think it will take to shake up or wake up more people, or what would wake up more people currently?
I think it has to be a part of it has to be more fearless, independent journalists exposing the state of Canada. I mean, you look at the UK, independent journalists are the ones who really had a big role in exposing the grooming gang scandal, and that woke a lot of people up. You look at Minnesota, you had Nick Shirley, who's just a year older than me. He's 24 years old. The Republicans have spent all this money trying to beat the Democrats in Minnesota. They've always failed, millions and millions of dollars. And this guy arrives with, a video camera and films fraud. And in the days that followed, Tim Walz announces not his resignation, but he announces that he's not running again. A very interesting coincidence, if you ask me, given this guy was supposed to be the vice president and out of nowhere, he bows out of politics. I think that actually is a great way to mobilize people, is to keep showing them. A lot of people have internal notions. They walk around Canada, they're being told by the media, crime is down, housing is down, everyone's happy. And then they look around and So if we're able to kind of confirm that assertion that no, they're being gaslit, they're being lied to, and we're able to expose that there's actually a lot going on in Canada. What we're reporting right now is the tip of the iceberg. I think that can be a way to mobilize some political change.
I was also going to say, it's interesting because we're going into the October 19th referendum, I guess, it's not necessarily we're going to separate from Canada now. It's a referendum on a referendum. That being said, I'm always interested in national conservative content creators' reaction. And to this point, a lot of them just kind of shied away from independence. But last night when I tuned in, you can see Mark Nixon, a lot of other people reporting on the referendum that's possibly going to happen on October 19th. And a lot of, especially the West Coast content creators in BC, Saskatchewan, Alberta, are now saying this is a way to apply pressure to Mark Carney and maybe make that social change before an election.
Yes, well, so my position on independence is, again, I'm personally not a separatist, but I've always supported a referendum because I think Alberta has been abused, taken advantage of for so long in a way that's just despicable. I mean, you look at Justin Trudeau, he was boasting about wanting to phase out the oil sands. He left Alberta out of his Canada 150 speech. He appointed to climate extremist Stephen Guilbeault. He platformed Greta Thunberg. And under him, the country lost $670 billion of oil and natural resources projects. So I think when you have such a deep problem, a deep liberal hatred for a place, they need to be woken up because, to Trudeau's credit, I don't think he ever thought there would be such a thing as Alberta independence. If this becomes an issue, people stop taking it for granted. So that's always been my position. So I do think, yes. I mean, you look, Mark Carney, a guy who wrote a book called Values about needing to phase out oil and gas, just made a deal, an MOU with Alberta. I know some people aren't a big fan of the MOU, but it is arguably much better than what Alberta had under Justin Trudeau, who wanted to put these caps on energy production, who wanted the net zero grids and whatnot. So already, without a referendum, we're already seeing some progress. And I think that if Mark Carney feels that that's not enough, he's going to have to step up because Canada needs Alberta. And this is part of the reason why I would like to see a peaceful resolution to all of this. Is Alberta is one of the most important provinces in Canada. And I think as we see the campaign ramp up, you're going to see a lot of people start to realize that. And hopefully this means the end of Alberta being taken advantage of. I do also think we need to reopen the Constitution, but I think that's a whole other conversation to be had.
And you yourself being young, but also you were one of the few people that did go into universities within Alberta to talk to young people, which I didn't
Mhm.
see many others really being either encouraged to go do it or wanting to go do it. I'm not sure why, because I think it is very important to do that. And thank you for filming it and letting us see what young people are thinking. But are the differences in the way and the perspectives that young people in universities or just in general gave to you regarding independence versus everybody else?
So again, like what I found interesting is wasn't like a strong support for independence. And there was one guy who told me that if things don't get better, he would support separation. Interestingly, there seems to be a bit more of older folks who support independence, but that's not a statistical answer. That's just based on what I've noticed. But a lot of young people, actually, I'll share this. After asking them about independence, I asked them the following question: if you were offered a job to the United States, would you take the job? 8 out of 10 of the people I spoke to said yes. Literally, like 80% of the college kids I spoke to said they would take a job in the US. I guarantee you, if you went down to a US college and you asked people if they would move to Canada, it would not be 80%. It probably wouldn't be 80% in a lot of other first world countries. And that's because the US has kept on getting wealthy, 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 and we've gotten poorer. So, I mean, that's actually what shocked me more than the independence questions. I expected there to be not like a very strong pro or anti separation on college campuses. But I was quite stunned by the amount of young people who told me they want out of Canada, just like moving out of Canada, right? Because they think the US has more opportunity.
Well, it's very interesting because a lot of people are actually emulating you now and going into campuses around Alberta. I'm seeing a lot of content come out from people within the independence movement and stuff like that. But also, it kind of sounds like um, they're not really in support of independence, but it doesn't sound like they're going to actually make an effort to go out and vote against it if the vote comes around.
Mhm. Well, this is a trend. Like young people don't vote as much as the baby boomers. That's why Carney won. I mean, Gen Z millennials voted for Pierre. My younger brother voted for his first time in a federal election. He literally came to me one day and said it was early voting. He said, "Let's go and vote for Pierre." And all my friends are voting for Pierre. It was the boomers who voted for Carney. The boomers vote much more. I forget the actual number. I had found that at one point for a column, much more. I think this is a similar scenario. Like, look, I think the turnout will be higher amongst older people for a referendum. Whenever there's an election, like, with the exception of like very big, like national elections, some provincial, when it's not a very, very high stakes vote, you don't see young people vote as much.
And on this, I wanted to ask you, do you think the young people are apathetic to politics, or do you think they're just not taking and their views and points of view are just not out there? They're not being taken into consideration, but they do care about politics in Canada. It's just we don't hear about it.
So young people in the Anglosphere, being into politics has changed a lot. So I got into politics when I was 14 years old. Back then, it was like I was an outlier. It was like I was always the only young person there. Uh, Things have changed. I mean, you look at thanks to figures like Charlie Kirk and other conservative influencers, it has become cool not only to be into politics, but to be a conservative. So now when I go to political events, in fact, the same political event I went to when I was 14, I go back to it every year, and it's always filled with young people, like a lot of young people. So there's a contingent of young people that are now really into politics. So it's become its own genre of interest, kind of like gaming or, um, cars, etc. That said, outside of that subset, so that subset existing is really good, but I think your average person, they're a bit more into it than maybe they were 10 years ago. But a baby boomer, I think, is a bit more politically engaged than your average Gen Z.
And what do you think would make them start caring a bit more? Like, if they knew what their current prospects are for the future and that they're not that good, and would that make them care a bit more? Would teaching them or telling them that, hey, this is what's actually going on and this is where you might actually end up if you don't start mobilizing and doing something about it?
So I actually think that actually part of the reasons why they're not engaged is because of how frustrated they are. I think there's a lot of apathy. There's a lot of people that are like, "What's the point?" And I've heard this from some young people who choose not to vote. What's the point? They will all do the same thing. I mean, in my case in Ontario, Doug Ford is as liberal as Mark Carney. It's like if you're a young person and that's the liberal, the conservative, they govern in arguably the same way, what's the point? I think there's a lot of young people who feel like all politicians are to blame for their problems and therefore are feeling less likely to be engaged. Pierre had managed to change that a bit. Again, I have friends that I went to high school with that, that are working in the trades, that are working in, working white collar job, very diverse, different types that haven't never been very political, that were like almost more motivated to vote for Pierre than even I was. And I was very motivated to vote for Pierre. So, there's a few things that can change, but I think there's a lot of young people that are just frustrated. And I will add, because they know that the boomers are outnumbering them at the polls, I think some of them have, especially in the last election, have come to the conclusion, well, again, like the boomers are just going to vote for the liberals, and what are we doing here?
And because of that apathy, do you think maybe movements like Alberta Independence Movement or Quebec or Saskatchewan or just the potential of doing either a change, getting change through voting for things like independence or actual independence, do you think that could actually motivate more people to say, hey, not all is lost, maybe we can have a voice?
I think it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. I think you'll have, a couple like young folks that are really into one side or the other. Uh, I do think the Forever Canadian side appears to be a bit more boom. Like there seems to be a higher percentage of baby boomers involved. But again, a lot of the separatists I've met are also baby boomers. Um, I'm not sure. I think that remains to be said because, like, we're not seeing at least I haven't seen. Maybe there is out there, and I just haven't seen it. But I haven't seen like a very strong contingent of young people supporting one side or the other. It seems to be more of like older people having this debate. To be very honest.
And maybe I'll ask a bit of a strange question because I was a big supporter of Polyev for a long, long time.
Mhm.
And I like his policies generally. They're the same first principles as a lot of the independence movements and stuff like that. The independence movement doesn't really have a leader. It's kind of grassroots. It's the people trying to make the change. When Polyev kind of promised the change, he couldn't win the election. Now he can't make the change for 3 years, but he's kind of stated he's going to come out and campaign against it on the ground in Alberta. I thought that was a bad move because you're telling the people, well, only I can give you the change. You have to wait 3 years for me when the people are trying to do it for themselves. Could there be a backlash that happens there, do you think?
Yes, it's a risk he's taking for sure. I understand where he's coming from. He cannot be seen as supporting Alberta independence. If you want to be the prime minister, you cannot be seen as wanting to break up the country you want to lead. He's under a lot of pressure right now from lots of different sides. There's a lot of people in the media that are completely undermining him. They want to kick him out because the reality is they want to replace Pierre Poilievre with a liberal, and they'll go through any lengths to do that. But then there's also, like, as I said, there are people on the separatist side who voted for Pierre Poilievre and won't be a fan of him doing this. So, I mean, given he's an Alberta MP, I do think he has to comment on it. I just hope that, I would recommend to him that whatever message he puts out there, try not to make it about himself. Don't just say, stay in Canada so you can vote for me. I mean, yesterday he talked about being the prime minister in waiting. Like, that's not how I would have personally gone around about it. I think I would put more emphasis on Mark Carney. I would talk about how, beyond him, how things can be fixed. I would propose solutions. Maybe if you vote for me, we will reopen the Constitution, or we will let Alberta appoint as judges. We will have the elected Senate, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's a tough one to navigate. I do think Pierre Poilievre is a very smart person. So, I mean, I think he'll have to, we'll have to see what he does. But yeah, it's not a place he definitely was hoping to be. I mean, he wanted to be prime minister. In an ideal world, he would be the prime minister right now, and we wouldn't be having this conversation, quite frankly.
And moving a little bit more towards journalism, and we know there's a big issue with journalism in Canada, and
Mhm.
that we do see more and more independent reporters, journalists with integrity, some that still have it, are on the more independent journalism side, like yourself. But you've also worked for semi-traditional, I would say, media like True North, or bigger media, independent media outlets like True North and The Hub and etc. What was that key, or those key pivotal moments that made you say, no, I actually want to do it all by myself?
It's honestly seeing the success of others. So I'll give you a couple example. During the campaign, the Hub had gotten me a flight pass. So basically, it's a super Air Canada ticket, and you can fly wherever you want in the country. For the I had 6 credits, so I could 6 times I could go wherever I wanted in the country, and I used that for a week to go and cover Pierre Polyev. Sitting beside me on most flights was this YouTuber known as the Pleb Reporter, who had managed to fundraise to be able to do the same thing. And this is somebody who just started a YouTube channel, and there he was sitting beside me, a journal, and we're both a bit odd in the sense that I was 22 years old, still in university, and then covering a campaign. And he's a former truck driver, so we were both like, we're both not conventional journalists. But I was looking at this and saying, well, he doesn't have a big organization with lots of staff. He's able to do this on his own, and he's getting like more views than CPAC on his own live stream. I've spoken to a couple, Ryan and Tanya Davies, who run Northern Perspective, because I profiled them in a piece for the Hub after the election. In that conversation, I was supposed to just interview them, but it ended up being a very like radicalizing conversation for me, and seeing again how this couple from Ontario is able to get a lot more views than many legacy media outlets with millions of dollars in production budget, with subsidies from the government. Seeing a lot of success in the US from people like Nick Shirley, people like Megan Kelly, Brad Cooper, I came to the conclusion that the future is personal brands. Add on top of that, the climate in Canada with Bill C-18, which censors independent media organizations on Facebook and Instagram, made it so that when I chose, I wanted to be independent. I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur anyways, but the reason I decided to, instead of just launching another news company, decided to launch a personal brand, was seeing the success of others, the current climate in Canada. I thought, let's give this a go. What I'm doing, I'm giving myself 2 years of trying to do this full time. I've been very blessed where I'm in capacity to be able to, take some risks, kind of dig into that. And I just want to see where this is going to go, because I do think there's a market for this type of stuff.
Well, and we've also seen in recent times it's happened in the EU, in the United States, and in Canada, especially with one of the organizations you worked with before, with True North. We see some content creators now crossing over to politics because they have an audience that really trusts them, and that gives them a voting base, and it gives them a lot of transparency I think a lot of other politicians don't have. What are your opinions on content creators that have crossed over, or in general, just that idea?
So it's like Andrew Lawton running for MP. Is that what you're asking me?
Well, Andrew Lawton, and there's actually been quite a few politicians
No,
with.
there's a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that that's
Oh,
what
yeah.
you're asking. Yeah, okay. So I think Andrew Lawton, Aaron Gunn, Matt Strauss, Roman Baber, Jamel Giovanni are excellent politicians. They're excellent men, and they're excellent politicians. The only thing that we have to do as a movement, and again, these 5 men wanted to run. Um, Andrew Lawton, I've worked with him. I knew he wanted to run. Aaron Gunn, he wanted to run. Like this was always something they wanted to do. But the thing is that our movement, our conservative movement, encourages content creators to run all the time. There's some of the other big names right now, almost in their comments every day. There's people like, you need to run for us. You need to run for us. I get approached a lot of being asked to run. Great. But the conservative movement also needs conservative commentators, content creators, podcasters, columnists, because the partisan talking points don't appeal to everybody. Even if they're great, Pierre Polyev has come up with some amazing messaging on his own. It's not good enough. You never see in the US people being like, Ben Shapiro, you should run. Sean Hannity, you should run. Glenn Beck, you should run. No, they understand that that's also an important arm of the conservative movement. And my only comment on there is, look, if you have a commentator that's always wanted to go into politics, like Aaron Gunn, like Andrew Lawton, that's always been what they wanted to do, that's fine. But I don't like the fact that it seems often the movement just wants every commentator to run. And I think as a movement too, and this is like something else that's my opinion, we cannot make it so as a movement there's a greater financial incentive to become an MP than there is to stay independent. So an MP makes, I think, $209,000 a year now. If someone's a commentator, the movement should be able to make sure that they're as well compensated, because their contributions to the movement is as strong. This is something that I mention when I do fundraising, and for me, but also when I try to encourage others to give to other independent media too. The Conservative Party of Canada raises $48 million a year. Imagine if with just 10% of that, we could have a $4.8 million fund for independent media. The stuff would be through the roof. I mean, I just came back that series of video from an Edmonton trip. It costed me $2,500 in travel costs, and we produced like 8 videos and probably got like almost 500,000 views on them. Like, and that's with $2,500. Imagine with $25,000, it could be done. Like, there's I think a lot of potential in this field. So I would say that's a bit of a long answer, but that's my overall thought. Nothing wrong with a commentator wanting to run for office. I just think we also have to build infrastructure on the commentary side and not just use that as a pipeline from commentator to MP.
And the media landscape in Canada is quite dire because, as you mentioned, it's either traditional media that's subsidized by the federal government and is essentially just the talking narrative point of the government itself, or
Yep.
independent media that has been a little bit left behind, even in comparison to the US, for example, with
Mhm.
the commentators and media that they're outlets that there are there. So, as young people, what can do you think young people would be even more interested in not just entering the space but consuming all the content if there was a bigger push by, as you mentioned, either financial actors or ways of funding it, aside from also having the imposition of Bill C-18, Bill C-9, Bill C-22, and everything else that the federal government is doing to silence the independent media?
Yes. So what's happening right now is there are some young people who test out journalism and they see that these independent media outlets don't want to pay them enough. And here's the thing: like, we talk about money often, and money is sometimes a very controversial thing to talk about. But we're living in a country right now where, since the 80s, the starting salary for someone uh, that is between 20, I believe, 24 and 35 has only gone up $2,000. While you look at inflation, it's gone up by a lot. People want to own homes. People want to travel. People want to have a decent way of life. So if you're an independent media outlet and you're telling someone who just finished university, we're going to pay you $40,000 a year, and this is a smart and ambitious person, they're going to say, I'm out. They're going to say no, and they're going to go work for a lobbying firm. That's actually almost what I did myself, and the hub came and saved me, and they offered me a really good paying position. So yes, I think we have. That's going to be the thing. You also have some young people right now. There's other people on YouTube that make content similar to me, but they're not in a position where they can afford to do it full time. So we do like a video a month. The thing is, if you do a video a month or 2 months, you cannot get the type of momentum of 3,000% growth of where you will ever be able to transition into doing it full time. So yeah, like I think first of all, if we're able to create an ecosystem where young people are well compensated and not paid wages that are just not adequate for today's Canada, and if we're also allowing, I've been very blessed. I've had people in the movement that have given me the resources to allow me to test this out. If we were able to triple or quadruple these number of people and give these opportunities to some of these other young folks, we could have a very interesting landscape.
So, do you think it's a matter of realigning priorities, I guess, for both those that want ideas communicated out, but also for those looking to communicate those ideas?
Sure. And by the way, like when I talk about like funding independent media, I'm not being like give me money. That's not my angle. Like independent creators make good money in Canada, like that are on YouTube. That's not the issue. The issue is that it's for me it's an investment. You're investing in the future of your country. You're investing in quality. Like if I won the lottery tomorrow, like I would give millions of my own winnings to independent media, because like I legitimately think that is the most effective way that you can impact change, because independent media goes out, it exposes, it shows people. Again, I go back to that Nick Shirley video. Tim Walz announces he's not seeking re-election shortly after. Aaron Gunn did a very good documentary, Vancouver is Dying, on the decline of Vancouver. And that was attributed to the loss of the socialist mayor, Kennedy Stewart. So, I just think that if you're somebody who's in business, who, likes to give to the Conservative Party based on the idea that, oh, I want to give because I want them to win, but you're limited by the contribution limit, which I believe is $1,700. Well, there's other places in which you can give money, and you will have a much greater return. I'm not going to disparage party, but you're going to have a very big return on investment. Again, with $15,000, Vancouver is Dying, you're able to remove the socialist mayor. Nick Shirley's video and the fraud. I don't know how much it costed. There was some security involved, but let's say it costed 30 grand. The Republicans have spent millions trying to get rid of thin walls, failed, and he was able to do it. So, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I just think this is a really good investment opportunity for anyone who's looking to make some change in Canada.
Well, and what do you think if we're at where we're at today with censorship bills just being
Mhm.
brought in, and there's a few that were brought in, but there's a lot more on the shelf he wants to bring in. And then we can kind of look over at the UK and the EU where they're making up to 12,000 arrests based upon speech online and stuff like that. Where do you see Canada in, let's just say, 3 years before the next election?
Oh, it's a big concern. Mark Carney talks about Canada being the most European, if not European country. The problem with Mark Carney is he doesn't admire the beautiful parts or the beautiful things about Europe. He admires the worst parts about Europe, and that is the European Union, the taxation, the regulation, and the censorship. There's been a series of bills. Bill C9 is the most concerning. The Liberals under Trudeau wanted to pass Bill C63, which is a dystopian nightmare of censorship. And yeah, I'm worried. Look, every time the Liberals have introduced a vaguely written bill about something and people have brought up objections, they've been called conspiracy theorists and the people have been proven right. This bill is too vague. Oh, no, it's not. Look where we are today. We're euthanizing the poor and the mentally ill that have seasonal depression. If you look at the conversion therapy law, there were concerns about that law too. And this law has led to some court cases that are a bit questionable regarding the gender aspect of that particular piece of legislation. Marijuana legislation. I can't tell the amount of young people I know that are basically psychotic now because they smoke too much legal marijuana. The list goes on. So on censorship, if immigration, made, that cost of housing, cancel culture, if everything, the drug experiment, if everything else is shown to be an absolute disaster because of a vaguely written bill, why should we expect this to not be the same? In fact, my fear is we will outdo the UK in terms of censorship if we allow Mark Carney, to put all of this agenda through, and that's a real cause for concern.
And thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And I have a couple last questions. And the first one is, what advice would you give to youth or politically engaged youth or people that are looking into journalism, independent journalism, that have become either disillusioned or disengaged with or apathetic with what's currently going on in Canada?
My answer is, pray to God, ask how you can be best involved in making that change. And once you feel like you're at peace with whatever conclusion you've come to with that, go for it. There's no one stopping you. You don't have to ask permission. I am talking to you from a webcam and a Yeti microphone, right? Go for it. Take a risk. I'm taking a huge risk right now. I turned down, I think, 4 or 5 job offers to pursue this. Take a risk. See how you can make your country better. Trust in God. And, the worst thing you can do is just sit at home and complain. That is the worst thing you can do. Try to make a difference. And there's many ways in which you can make a difference.
Exactly. And also, just one more, just because I wanted to ask you, regarding
Yeah.
journalistic integrity, where do you think it started to fail within Canada?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay. What happened is around Trump, a lot of the media in the US have been covering Trump fair and balanced. And then they began to see themselves as guilty because, well, we just elected him. And as a result, you actually have studies that show that journalists in the US, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same in Canada, the majority of American journalists no longer believe a story should have two sides portrayed equally. So I think that was part of what caused it. I do think the subsidies have had a role. And here's what the subsidies do: they don't necessarily control the entire media like it is. But you know what it does? The media will be hesitant to cover subsidies to other industries because they're also receiving some of those same subsidies. It does compromise the media. If your entire company relies on government funding and there's a politician promising to cut that funding, can you be trusted to cover that fairly? That's a very reasonable question to ask. So I just think over time, and then the 2020 woke movement, there began to be an insertion of social justice journalism, which basically, instead of being like journalism to report the news, it's an advocacy-based journalism to make the world a better place. That became a lot more mainstream in legacy media newsrooms. And yeah, like all of that together, it just meant that you have a lot of journalists today, unfortunately, that are more interested in being activists. And another issue is you have people that are click obsessed or so obsessed with the clicks, they're willing to throw out their journalistic integrity to get the clicks.
And I do think it's a double-edged sword with social media and the clicks that sometimes do help, but can also turn
It's
into.
a balancing act. So
Yeah.
like I've managed to find a way to make it work. Like I had, you have to use clickbait to be successful in this space. That's just a reality that I had to accept. But you can make your clickbait factual,
And
you
smarter,
know,
I would say as well.
and that's what I do. That's what I do. You know, and that's what we should be doing, and giving people a fair shake. People like journalistic integrity. That's the number one compliment I get in my comments. Actually, it's not people don't compliment my hair or what I wear. They compliment my journalistic integrity, which shows that people actually appreciate this stuff.
Exactly, and as they should. And we always end our interviews asking our guests one last question, which is, what does freedom mean to you?
That's such a good question. Freedom for me is it's the free like it's not just do whatever you want. It's to be able to live freely in a sane society. So like I should have the freedom to make this content, have it be shared on social media without algorithmic suppression from the government. And I should have the freedom to keep most of my money and not be taxed at 53 or 54%. To me, that's freedom. But I think freedom also has some responsibilities. Like you don't have the freedom to go and terrorize other people. I think there's a there's it has like freedom is the freedom to live within the confines of a society and to not be bothered and hindered by government or by subjective rules. Like I want to be able to go for a walk. I don't want the government to tell me I can't go for a walk because there's a virus. I want to be able to keep my money. I want to be able to travel to the US. I want to be able to buy American wine at the liquor store, right? To me that's freedom. It's about respecting free people, but it's also about making sure that as we exercise our freedom we don't trample on the freedom of others. That's we talk about limits to freedom. That to me is like the only limit to freedom. I really think we need that's a very fair way to have that balance. Free to do what you want as long as you're not like actively restricting the freedom of others, like. And yeah, and just one more thing, that the freedom convoy I think had a changed a lot of people's minds on freedom and the importance of freedom, because it kind of just reminded everybody how important that is, and that we shouldn't just be at the mercy of government.
Ellie, thank you so much. And please do continue doing the very important work you're doing and with the journalistic integrity that you show as well. But thank you so much for
Thank
sitting with us.
you. Thank you so much, and God bless you, and good luck with your podcast as well. This was a pleasure.
Thank you.